This morning, it's my privilege to offer something a little different this morning. We're going to lean in a little to my love for art history. And you know that if you've been here around for a while, you'll know that when I speak, I usually have pictures. And so today we're going to look at one of the most famous paintings of the Last Supper. This is the one by Leonardo da Vinci. I think you probably already know it. And so as we go through it, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about it. And you might be asking yourself, why are we going to look at a picture of a painting for this morning? And it's for two reasons. The first reason is that I would like to we want to do something different and a little bit special this morning. That's the first reason. And the second reason is that this is the most famous painting we have of the little community that Jesus built around him. He was modeling for us what community looks like and how to do community well. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning as well. I'm sure that you can probably picture the Lord's Supper in your mind's eye. And here's a modern meme of what it might have looked like a couple of years ago. So now that you've kind of got that remembrance of what that picture looks like, try to remember what you know about it already. Believe it or not, that painting was incredibly controversial and groundbreaking at the time that Leonardo painted it. Excuse me. He depicted a really ordinary Passover meal, but it wasn't so ordinary after all, and we'll talk about that. So one of the reasons we're talking about community this morning is that we've been talking about it for quite a while already. We've looked at the Vineyard vision and values across the country. What does our movement stand for and how do we do things? We've talked about how to be more like Jesus and how to live in community here with intentionality. And we've also been thinking about how to do community well here at Aldergrove Vineyard. So in some ways, this painting also gives us an image of the living message that Jesus left for us about how to follow him and how to become more like him. There are other world religion leaders who left a book of instructions or techniques for how to follow the teachings that they had. But Jesus didn't do that, not himself personally. Instead, he left us this small group of men and women, and they were his inner circle, they were his community. And they were meant to be left as a living demonstration of how to be like him and how to live by his teachings. So, of course, after his death, the 4 Gospels were written, and so now we do have eyewitness accounts of the life and the teachings of Jesus. And I'm so grateful for the New Testament because we can study it, and when we study the Gospels, we learn more about who Jesus was and what he was really like. And hopefully in doing so, we become more like him. And that's what the disciples did in Jesus' time. They spent a lot of time with him, and they listened carefully to what he said, and they watched really carefully to see what he did. And then they did their best to do likewise. And that's what it meant to be a disciple back then. So here's an image of what the painting actually looks like in real life. It's painted on the wall in a beautiful old church in Milan, in Italy. And I actually don't think that this is an emotional sermon at all, but I'm not expecting to cry in any way. But in case I do, I'm just giving you a little warning. It's just a thing I do. I feel emotional about it because I got to see it in real life. It was pretty cool. It was painted in 1498, which is 525 years ago. And it was just meant to decorate the dining room in a monastery. And Leonardo was experimenting in the way that he painted this particular painting. Usually, a painting that goes on the wall was actually part of the wall. So they would take the plaster that was going to form the wall, and they would mix the paint into it and integrate it right in there, and then paint with plaster up on the wall. That's how the Sistine Chapel is built, has been painted, and a lot of the other paintings from this time that are on ceilings or walls, except this one. Leonardo decided he would try just painting with oil and tempera right onto a wall. It would be a little bit like doing a mural nowadays. And as he did that, people wondered if it would work and how it would be, but in a very short time, the paint started to fade, and the colors they muted, and then the paint itself started to chip off within a few years. And so people were really worried that the whole piece would be lost altogether. So there were many attempts over the centuries since it was painted to try to restore it. And there have been 6 major attempts made. The last one, which will probably be the last one, was from 1977 to 1999. So 22 years. And one woman worked on it. She was an expert. And she just worked on about an inch and a half square maybe, for a week at a time through the whole piece for 22 years, which is dedication. And it was a very controversial restoration because the decision was made to take off all of the layers that had been put on there by other people over the centuries. And over the centuries, there had been lots of editing. Faces were changed, expressions were changed, things on the table, things on the table were covered up, and a lot of things were lost. And so once all of the paint was taken off that wasn't original, then the true condition of the actual painting was revealed, and it was in kind of worse shape than anyone thought. But fortunately for us, there was and for the last restorer, there was a really careful copy of this painting that was made by an apprentice of Leonardo about 2 or 3 years after the first painting was painted. They could see that it wasn't going to last, and so a painting was made, and it's in Magdalen College in Cambridge, which is where C.S. Lewis was a professor for many, many years. And it's about life size, and it's on canvas, and so we have that one to refer to, and that's the one we'll look at today so that you can see the details. So Leonardo was a famous artist. He was also a mathematician and a scientist, who was also a man of really deep faith who knew his Bible. So he used his knowledge of perspective to create a composition that causes all of the lines of perspective to converge on the face of Jesus. And this zoom one helps us. Oh, that one's up there now. It's hard to see, but there's a little arc over the center window there, and that is important. And if you were trying to reproduce this painting, you would have lines of perspective, and they would all land in the middle on Jesus's face. And so everything about this painting is designed for us to focus our attention on Jesus. And we see him there in the middle. He's calm, he's quite at peace, he's resting in the divine purposes of the Father, and he's preparing to go to the cross. But on either side of him, the 12 disciples are all reacting individually and pretty dramatically to his words, because he's just said that one of them is going to betray him. There's really not enough room for everybody behind that table. They're all crowded in, and that creates a sense of real energy and kind of human chaos. And it contrasts with Jesus, who is both fully man and fully divine, but very, very calm. And the arrangement, which is in art words the composition, emphasizes the centeredness of Jesus in this space and also in all of creation. And his arms and his head, they kind of make a perfect equilateral triangle. And the head forms the center of a circle, which I think I mentioned. So that arc at the top of the window that you can barely make out, if you kind of follow the arc all the way around and pretend there's a circle there, that would be, Jesus's face would be right in the middle of that circle. So there was a lot of intentionality about the way he painted this painting. But let's take a look at that copy that I mentioned. This is Rizzoli's Last Supper. So this is the painting by Giovanni Rizzoli that was painted a few years after the original. And in it we can see that there's a lot of brighter colors, luminous colors, and a lot of the lost details that we're going to talk about. And we're going to look at this copy so that we can see them. And this shows 2 moments at one time. First, this is just after Jesus says, "This is my bread, this is my body, and this wine is my blood. Take it and eat it." And the second thing that it depicts is the moment when Jesus reveals that someone there at that table is going to betray him. And that's the dominant story here. You might think that this was the first Lord's Supper painting ever painted. That's what I thought initially. But when I looked into it, I realized that this was one of many had been painted before. And they were all following a certain formula and a certain way of having it done and painted. And so we're going to look at two examples of what was more typical and what was expected of Leonardo when he was asked to paint the Last Supper. So this first one is from Rosselli. It was painted in 1482. It's actually painted maybe 10 years before Leonardo's, and this is the one that most people would have expected him to copy. So you can see it's a really opulent room. It's in a palace. It's kind of fit for a king. It's a fancy table with lots of room for everybody. And we can see that it's the Last Supper because everyone has a halo. And even Judas has a halo, but his is very, very faded and kind of dark. And he's sitting on our side of the table. It actually takes a minute to find Jesus in the picture. He's kind of behind Judas there. And everyone is stiff, kind of saintly looking. There's a lot of elbow room, but there's almost no expression or energy in this painting. It's really flat. The second painting is another along the same themes. This one is from Castagno, and it was painted in 1450. We've got another really grand palatial room. And again, we see Judas sitting on our side of the table. And there's a little more individuality in the disciples here, but again, everyone seems to be pretty subdued. And again, it's kind of hard to find Jesus. He's again sort of tucked behind Judas. And these are really typical. If you look this up, you'll see painting after painting where Judas is on our side of the table and is like, I wonder which one is going to betray Jesus. But in contrast, Leonardo, can you go to the next one, Malachi? Thanks. In contrast, Leonardo has simplified everything so that our eyes focus in on Jesus. And we can see that Judas the betrayer is in amongst the crowd. And when they ask, who would do such a thing? Is it me? It's not yet obvious who it will be. Another thing that's really important to note here is the clothing. Da Vinci made a point of dressing his disciples in clothes that would have been very contemporary to his viewers. The clothes that the men are wearing are exactly what everyone would have been wearing on the street at the time. And this is what you would have worn, if you were going to dinner at a friend's house, so dressed up a smidge but not too much. So nowadays, if we saw this painting painted today, maybe everybody would be wearing something like a plaid shirt and jeans and Blundstones and a toque, if it's November and you're in Canada. So when people looked at that, it was shocking to them because the other paintings were all either sort of biblical clothing or very, very, very fancy clothing. So Leonardo wanted the viewers to relate to and see themselves in these disciples. And we want to talk about why that was so important to him and why should it matter to us. Leonardo was a man of great faith who studied people, and he understood human nature. So he understood that Jesus gathering this group of men from very different backgrounds was important. He was modeling for us what the community of faith would look like. That's what Jesus was doing. So he gathered men and women who were from very different parts of society. Some were wealthy, some were not. They all had different backgrounds and professions. There were different levels of education, and there were very different political views. He was teaching and modeling something to all of us about how church ought to be. This group of 12 that Da Vinci portrays here would have been a really complicated band of brothers. There were also a whole group of women that were alongside them, but they didn't come into this picture, and that's okay. So it would have been a really real and very messy community. And it would definitely have had very strong disagreements about many important things. And yet they were all drawn together to share their love of Jesus. So as each one of them became more like their rabbi, by spending time with him and listening carefully to him and imitating him, they also grew to love one another. And that's what Da Vinci portrays in this picture. So they were called together by Jesus and would become a family of faith. And they were known as his disciples because they loved one another as he had loved them. I think their love for each other, despite those differences, was what really drew others to this community. It was a community like no other. It would be strange to see people associating from different parts of society, and people didn't really know why that was happening, so they were drawn to it. And they were drawn to that love. It was like a magnet, and it was just something that was so intriguing to people. So who were these men, and how has Da Vinci portrayed them? Let's take a quick look at who is who. So you can see the original up in the corner, and that's why we're going for the big one. So first we begin with Jesus. He's always in the center. His red robe stands for his humanity, and his blue cloak stands for his divinity. That's almost universally true in paintings from this era, that blue stands for divinity. His left hand has his palm up towards the bread, and it's scattered there all across the table, like it still is in northern Italian homes. And his palm is down in the other direction. His right palm is down, and he's reaching towards a cup or a bowl to dip bread into it, and he's sharing that with Judas. John 13:21 says that Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." His disciples stared at one another, at a loss of which of them he meant. So let's take a closer look at them. To his right, we see the first of 4 groups of 3. First, we see the troubling figure of Judas, and there are several clues that it's him. First, there's a shadow that's kind of over him. And this shadow, some people think initially that his face is like that, his skin is darker as well, and it may be he was different than the others in that he was from Judea and the rest of them were from Galilee. I don't know if that would be it, but I think the most art people would say it's about the darkness that comes over him. So he's in shadow. And second, he's reaching towards the same bowl that Jesus is. Mark 14:20 says that when Jesus says, "It is one of the 12, the one who dips bread into this bowl with me." And Judas has become a disciple of Jesus, and he's hung out with Jesus for 3 years, and he's given Jesus that time and his service, but he hasn't really given Jesus his heart. And Jesus is aware of that. And then the third really unmistakable clue that you've probably noticed by now is the bag that he's clutching. And we know what's in there. There's 30 pieces of silver, which is the price of his betrayal. Okay, there they are. Okay, so he is the only disciple who seems to barely react in this moment. It's like he's expected it. John 13:27 says, "Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, 'What you are about to do, do quickly.'" Behind Judas, we can see Peter. He's always been one of my favorites. He has that impetuous passion that we always talk about. And if you look, you can see he's already got his dagger drawn, and it's behind Judas's back. So you can see it, it's pretty sharp. And that's a symbol to let us know it's Peter, but also to let us know that he's ready to defend Jesus, and he's leaning in to whisper into John's ear. There's an ancient historian named Josephus who describes Peter as a typical Galilean. And the Talmud, which is a book of ancient Jewish writings, says this of the Galileans: "They were more anxious for honor than for gain. They were quick-tempered, impulsive, emotional, easily aroused by an appeal to adventure, and loyal to the end." And I didn't know it at the time, but all of the apostles were Galileans. They were all from Galilee, except for Judas, who is from Judea. So I wonder now if maybe he felt like an outsider from the very beginning. Next, there's John, and he's at Jesus' right hand, and he's the beloved apostle. He refers to himself as the one that Jesus loved, and he, along with his brother James, is one of the sons of thunder. He's wealthier than the other fishermen in this group, and their father had hired helpers, which is mentioned in Mark 1:20. So we know that they were running more of a business. And then John is the only one who seems really calm. His hands are folded. He's at peace in this moment of turmoil. Calm has come from the certainty, I think. He knows deep in his heart that his love for Jesus is sure and strong, and that he could never possibly be the betrayer. This is the John that wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and also Revelation. Da Vinci took note of John 13:25, which says that Peter asks John to find out who the betrayer is. I think that maybe Peter is leaning in here and saying, John, you're the closest one to Jesus. Find out who it is, and I'll take care of him. And so Leonardo has taken some artistic choices here. He's made John much younger than the other disciples, which is the traditional view of John. And he's made his face especially bright and light. And I think that's to represent his clear conscience and his deep love for Jesus. It's also meant to be a foil or a contrast to Judas, who's so nearby and is in the darkness. And here in Rizzoli's painting, we can see a lot of details that are lost in the original. We can just make out faint halos on everyone's head but Judas. And these were added by Rizzoli. They were not in the original, because Da Vinci wanted to emphasize the ordinariness of these people and to increase our connection with them. He wanted us to ask ourselves, which disciple am I most like? Which reaction would I have? Could I ever possibly betray or deny Jesus? We can see some details that are lost, nearly lost in the original, like the folds on the tablecloth. There's transparent glasses, which would have been a real thing in that time. Murano is not far from Milan, and that's where they make the transparent glass, and it was still a new thing in that time. We can also see Jesus's feet and fancy sandals. They're really quite fancy. Later, they cut a door into the original Leonardo. I don't know, at some point they did a reno. It's just a Leonardo da Vinci. They cut a door in the middle of it. When we go back to see it later, you can look for the door frame. And then now, ironically, the door frame is filled in, so I don't know what happened. But the sandals were lost in that decision. And the thing that's most noticeable that's completely lost in the original is that right near Judas's arm, there is spilt salt. And that was already considered a bad omen, that something bad was going to happen when you spilled the salt. So it's another sign that Judas has already been filled with evil. And if we go to the next slide, we can take a look at Thomas, James, and Philip. Tucked in the back, we can see Thomas, who's pointing his finger to heaven. And that's our big clue to his identity, because in John 20:24, he said, he was wondering about whether Jesus had really risen. And he said, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand in his side, I will not believe. So he's often called Doubting Thomas. And I think he looks a lot like Bob Ross, actually. How many were thinking that? Yeah, I think he should just as well be called Loyal or Courageous Thomas. As I was reading through the Gospels one time, I noticed that in the story of the raising of Lazarus, there's this little line in John 11:16. And Bethany is not so far from Jerusalem. And in that area where Jesus had been before, it wasn't really safe for him to be there, and he left because they were wanting to arrest him. And Thomas knew that they were going back there. And so he pretty loyally and bravely says, let us also go that we may die with him. So I think of him as loyal Thomas these days. And next we have James in the green tunic. And he's the brother to John and the other son of Zebedee, or sons of thunder. And here we see a reaction that's more like the sons of thunder. And along with Peter, he's part of that inner circle with John. And James reacts completely opposite to John's calm. He's flinging his arms out in disbelief and he's got a really furrowed brow, and he seems to be angry at the thought of betrayal. And he was the first of many of the disciples to be martyred, and that's mentioned in Acts 12. Next to him, there's Philip, and his hands are up by his chest, and it's almost like he's got consternation, and he's kind of saying, is it me? Could it be me? And he seems so sad and anguished. It's like he can't even bear the thought of that possibility. And we don't know a lot about Philip, except that he was fluent in Greek, that he loved to study the scriptures, and he's the one that witnessed to the eunuch in Acts chapter 8. So we know that he was wealthier possibly than the others, definitely had more of an education, so maybe he had more privilege than some of the others in the group. Continuing down this side of the table, we can see Matthew, Thaddeus, and Simon. In the gray tunic, we see Matthew with his arms extended towards Jesus. And his whole body is kind of communicating disbelief. His face is full of despair. He was also called Levi, and he had been a tax collector, which were amongst the most despised people in Israel because they were equated with thieves, because they'd often sort of pad their own pockets with extra when they were collecting the heavy taxes for the Roman oppressors. And just to Matthew's left, in the middle of this group, we have Thaddeus. He's in the mustard-colored robe, and he's sometimes called Jude. Sometimes he's called Lebbaeus. He was the brother of James the Lesser. He's on the other side of the table. And he was thought to be a really intense Jewish nationalist. So he was a zealot. And on the opposite end of the political spectrum from Matthew, so he was basically trying to overthrow the Roman government. And there's a line in John 14:22 where he makes it clear that he was imagining that Christ should be known to the world, not as some sort of savior prepared to suffer, but as a mighty ruling king. And he seems to have joined the band initially to help Jesus become the king. He didn't understand then that Jesus was the king of an entirely different kind of kingdom. A fun fact about this painting is that many people believe that Leonardo painted himself as Thaddeus, that's a self-portrait. And it actually looks a lot like him at that time. And that was a common practice. You can find Michelangelo in his paintings, you can find Raphael in his paintings, and so it's really quite possible. The last person we see in this group is Simon the Zealot in the red cloak. He's identified as a Canaanite, which was another term for a really radical Jewish zealot. And in his younger days, he was determined also to overthrow the Roman oppressors. Oh, that's Freudian. About the Roman oppressors and to see self-rule for the Jewish people. So he wasn't really interested in having a king, but he wanted the Jewish people to be able to rule themselves. And I can imagine some really heated discussions between these three. And I especially find it interesting that Leonardo puts them all together as friends at the end of this table. And at the other end of the table, we see Bartholomew, James the Lesser, and Andrew. On the far left, we see Bartholomew. He's often called Nathaniel, and he's in a gray tunic, and he's got an emerald overcloak. And he leans on the table with a look of concern on his face. And he's the only disciple that was probably of noble birth. He is likely descended from the king of Geshur, who is mentioned in 2 Samuel 3:3. And then there's James the Lesser in the middle of this group. And he's got ginger hair and a red tunic. And he's leaning his right hand on the next disciple. And it's almost like he's got a pensive look on his face, as if he's saying, like, wait, what did Jesus just say? And it's like he's taking it in. He's called the Lesser because he was younger than James, the son of Zebedee. This is the James that wrote the book of James. And the tradition says that he was a man who had a strong character and a really fiery temper. So that might be why Leonardo decided to give him red hair. I'm not sure. And last we see Andrew. He's got a gray beard and a bright yellow tunic. And he's the brother of Peter. And his hands are both turned up as if he's completely taken aback. And his mouth is kind of turned down in doubt and dismay. So let's look again at the original Last Supper. This group of men had nothing much in common except their shared love of Jesus and their desire to serve him and follow him closely. And as I was preparing to speak about how Jesus used this group as an example of community, I read over the accounts of each of the Gospels and how the Last Supper is described by each of them. And I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before and I thought I'd share it with you in case it's new to you too. When we talk about how Jesus washed the disciples' feet at the Last Supper and Passover, I think I've heard many sermons that talk about Jesus' humility and his servant leadership, and I've always gotten the impression that he kind of met them at the door, and they had really dirty and dusty feet from the Palestinian roads, and that he took the job of one of the lowliest servants in the house. Typically, it was a job given to someone ranking really low on the slave scale, because it was a dirty job. And he just met them at the door and kind of cleaned their feet before the meal began. And yet, in John's account, here's how the timing of that event is actually described. So in John 13, 1-5, this is just part of the description of the meal. And this is just at the very beginning of John 13. I love the verse, I love the phrase, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And that's a sermon in itself. But I'd like to focus on, just for a second on the phrases that are in green. So in the second verse it says, the evening meal was in progress. And then a little bit later it says, so he got up from the meal and he took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist and then began to wash everyone's feet. So it seems like Jesus decided to wash the disciples' feet at an early part of the typical Passover meal. There's kind of a host ceremony that goes with it. And there's a moment where the host would ceremonially wash their hands. And it seems to be that that's the moment when he decided to take it up a notch and wash everyone's feet. In an old commentary that I have that I really love, the author synthesizes the Gospels together. He kind of dovetails all the stories so that you can kind of see all the pieces and details together. And he adds in the Jewish customs and the culture and how things would have gone in the day. And in that, I learned a little bit more about this dinner. In the Luke account, it mentions that an argument broke out among the disciples about who was the greatest among them. And the commentators said that this argument was likely happened a little earlier as the disciples came into the room and the table was set up and they had to choose their spots where they were going to be around the table. And as the host of the meal, Jesus would have had, there was a definite pattern and a very specific way of sitting at the table. The host sat at one side with one person beside him, and then the chief guest, the honored guest, would sit to the left. And then it kind of went around the corner and back again. And the spot directly across would be, from the close friend, would be sort of the lowest place at the table. So maybe I should have done a diagram, but just picture a rectangle with John here, Jesus here, chief guest here, and then all the other guests. So, with the lowest one being back up here. So, it seems clear that John was on the right, but surprisingly, it's also very likely that Judas the betrayer was actually in the chief guest spot, which I find just really interesting. It's likely because one other thing that's likely is that because Jesus started washing the disciples' feet, and he started with Peter, that Peter was at the lowest place at the table, which is the other end on the other side, which may or may not have been to his liking. We know that Judas was at the place of honor because Jesus gives him the bread first. And that was something that was always reserved for the honored guest. And also there's a point in the Matthew account when Judas actually dares to ask Jesus, am I the betrayer? And Jesus says, you've said it yourself. And I think that was a whispered exchange that not everyone else heard. But I think that Matthew might have been sitting across the table. The commentator mentioned that Matthew was probably sitting across and could hear that exchange or see it. And so that's why it's included in his version of the story. So Jesus' choice to wash the disciples' feet in the middle of this meal was a practical demonstration brought on probably by that argument about who is the greatest and the kerfuffle about who ended up sitting where, because he wanted them to serve and to love one another with humility and with grace, and to set aside their differences and their disagreements that they had in order to really see one another and to love one another well. And in John 13:34, just a little bit later in the passage, he says, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." This is a challenge to us as well. Church communities are unique in that they're often made up of people from all different backgrounds and ways of life who may not have much in common except their love for God and their love for one another. And it's that love that the disciples and the other members of the early church in Acts had that drew people to that community. And despite their differences, they chose to love Jesus and to follow him closely, doing the works of the kingdom. And they chose to love one another well. And lastly, to build connections with those who didn't yet know of Jesus and to share the good news. It's these three things that are the essence of what the community of disciples that Jesus left for us to see were an example of. It's the essence of how we should live our lives as the church community. Today we celebrate that he is risen, and he is risen indeed. So I looked for quite a while for a great painting that would show you the risen Christ. But truthfully, I couldn't find one that wasn't overwhelmingly medieval. And so I thought I'd share this image with you instead. This has been a favorite of mine for some time. So this is a painting called Peter and John Running to the Sepulchre on the Morning of the Resurrection. It's by Eugene Bernand, and it's painted in 1898, so it's already 125 years ago. And as I look at that painting of those two racing, I think about what's going on in their minds. They've left most of the other disciples in an upper room together, very likely the same room that they had met in for the Last Supper. And they're running with a sense of anticipation to see if it's true that the tomb is empty and that Jesus has risen. And their faces are just full of emotion, and they can be read several ways. I think John's face says that he's worried that Jesus' body has been stolen. That was definitely the rumor. And his hands also seem to say that he has hope, that what Jesus said is true, and that he has indeed risen. And then Peter's gaze makes me think that he's lost in a jumble of thoughts. He's trying to keep up with John, and we know that John eventually wins the race and reaches the tomb first. The artist's use of color here is really important. The lavenders and yellows of the sky let us know that it's early morning, and these colors are both still strongly associated with Easter. Lavender is associated with the end of grief, and yellow is strongly associated with hope and new life. So these are the perfect colors for an Easter morning sky. But here we see Peter in a really dark cloak, because at this moment he's in a state of deep grief. And at the time that lavender was associated with grief, black was associated with deep grief. And you wore mourning for a year, and you started with black, and as the year progressed, you went all the way through all the shades of purple until you got to lavender, which meant that the year was nearly over. So we see that Peter is wearing this very dark cloak because I think he is worried. He's denied Jesus, and he feels so much regret and shame about that. And he's worried about his relationship with Jesus, and he maybe doesn't quite dare that Jesus will have really risen from the dead and will forgive him. And I think he's desperate to make it right. So he's longing for restoration of that relationship. And it's good to know that at the end of that part of the story, Jesus' relationship with Peter is restored and he is forgiven. And so, as we think about the end of Easter, about when they get to the tomb and they see that Jesus is risen, we see that Jesus is the center of the whole story, and he's the center of Da Vinci's Last Supper, and he's our center too. He left us an example of community that learned to keep their focus on him and to keep reaching out and building connections with those who don't know him yet. And as we all follow our Rabbi Jesus and seek to become more like him, we'll become a community of faith that brings him glory. We can bring hope and good news to whoever we interact with in our ordinary daily lives, and we can bring light and peace and hope to dark places. As we celebrate this Easter Sunday, may you feel God's joy and his peace settle deep in your spirit. And as we remember the resurrection of Jesus and we celebrate that he is risen, I pray that you'll remember that he is risen indeed. And we haven't talked about it, but I just wanted to say that at some point in the service towards the end, if anyone would like prayer of any kind, we'd be happy to pray for you. Many of us here would love to do that. So thank you so much.